name is Henry Wang. I'm from FileMaker, and this session is called Path Toward Good Design. First, a little bit about me. I'm a dad to two little kids, 6 and 2, so that's a full-time job in and of itself. But I'm also a designer. I've worked at a number of places: Intuit, Oracle, Siebel, Bayer Diagnostics. Worked mostly on desktop and some mobile apps. And at FileMaker, I'm currently designing primarily for FileMaker Pro Advanced. So if you've got good things or bad things to say about it, feel free to approach me at the end and let me know about it. I do want to hear about it. But more importantly, I'm also someone who learned to design. Now, as a kid, I wasn't particularly artistic growing up, and I studied science in school. Out of school, I worked as a biomedical researcher, so I couldn't be any further from being a designer. So that leads me to what we have in common. The fact that we're here in a design session, I'm going to assume that you value good design and that you're trying to get better at it. Also, as a FileMaker user, I think we have a do-it-yourself mentality, and that's a very important point because I think if you have that, then you can learn to design on your own. Okay, so what's this session about? It's not going to be about design principles. It's not going to be about design process, although I'll touch on that a little bit. It's not going to be about FileMaker Pro Advanced features like layouts or themes that help you do your design work. There are other sessions, I think they've already occurred or they will happen, that go into that in more detail, so I'd highly recommend attending those. What is this session about? Primarily, it's about learning to design through the technique of deliberate imitation or copying. Now, this technique is not a magic bullet. It's not a shortcut. It'll still take time and practice to get it right. I also want to take a little bit of time to try to cut through some of the noise surrounding design and hopefully give you like a baseline understanding from my perspective. And hopefully that'll give you a good foundation for you to learn more about design. If you're new to design, I want to help clear up any misconceptions you may have so that you're focused on the right things. The first misconception is that you need to be a designer in order to design. That's just not true. Design is a learned skill. And like I said earlier, if you've got the right mentality, you can learn to do it competently. Another misconception is that design is about making things look good. Now that is true, but it's only half the story. Design is also about the way things work. So if you've got something that doesn't work well at all or has some usability issues, it really doesn't matter how good it looks. You need both parts. The next misconception is that design is about learning a piece of software like Photoshop. Photoshop is very powerful. You can do almost anything with it. But in the end, it's just a tool. It doesn't help you at all figure out what to do with it. The next misconception is about design principles. There may be a perception that all you need to do is follow a checklist of principles. I think the problem with that is principles are typically very generic and broad, so you'll still need to know how to apply them and when to disregard them. Now, to be clear, I believe in design principles, but you still need experience to apply them properly. And the final misconception is that there's this new design philosophy, new design process or approach that's the key to good design. In my opinion, if you do the basics really, really well, you'll be in good shape. Wait until you have some experience and a good foundation in design before attempting to jump on the new bandwagon. So speaking of design foundations, what do you really need to know about design? First is the jargon. Now, every discipline has its jargon, design is no different. Designers love jargon, designers want to be unique, so we invent a lot of terms. But if you look at these, and this is just a small sample, I mean, there's a lot of overlap. You've got user experience, you've got customer experience. There's all sorts of designs: interaction design, interface design, UI design, which I didn't even include on here, service design, graphic design, user-centered design, visual design. And there's also 3 terms to describe the user. There's user profile, persona, archetype. Now, to be fair, these are slightly different, but do we really need 3 terms to describe essentially the same thing? My advice is to start by learning about these. And the intent here is not to sort of get you to understand what all these are in the course of one session, but merely to point you to the things that you might want to learn more about. Now, this started out as a much longer list, but I narrowed it down based on sort of the basic questions that I ask myself when I approach a design problem. What's the overall experience, the user experience? What are the user's assumptions, their mental model? How do users interact with the application, the interaction design? How can visuals help the user be successful, visual design? What does the user want to do, the use cases? And what are the steps required to achieve their goal, which is the workflow? And finally, what reusable design solutions or patterns I can use to help solve the problem, the design patterns. So again, my suggestion, learn about these first. So here's another fundamental, and you probably learned about this or seen it elsewhere. This is how I think about design. It's a classic model. You might have seen it visualized as an iceberg, partly in and outside of the water. Basically, the overall user experience is composed of 3 parts. You've got the mental model, again, which is the user's assumptions about how things work, either in the physical world or with applications that you've encountered, plus the interaction design, plus the visual design. The takeaway here is that a design is only successful if all 3 elements are successful. So don't put too much emphasis on one thing, and certainly don't ignore any one thing. And finally, a little bit about the user-centered design process. You've probably seen some version of this also. In the discovery and define phases, you try to understand and frame the problem, and that's very important. Otherwise, you may end up solving for the wrong problem. Then you explore different ideas for how to solve for the problem. You build prototypes, and you test with actual users. And this whole process is very iterative, so depending on your results, you might have to go back to an earlier phase. Now, I want to get on my soapbox a little bit and share with you some of the mistakes that I've seen, and certainly some mistakes that I've made over the years. The first is really fight the urge to jump straight to problem solving. Make sure you have a clear understanding. Otherwise, you might be solving the wrong problem. 2, when you're in the exploration phase, try to go really broad. Don't get tunnel vision and focus on any one particular solution. Let the testing help you narrow that down. And of course, 3, validate your design with actual users, because in my opinion, that's really the true test of whether a design is successful. And finally, don't get married to any particular idea. Be open to change. So that's it for the design foundation stuff. I want to spend the rest of the session focused on design phase and how you can get on the path toward good design. So what is the path toward good design? This is it in a nutshell, in my opinion. You've got to get from imitation to inspiration, from copying what you've seen to building upon what you've seen. So when you're starting out as a designer, you tend to imitate or copy what you've seen, and that's natural. What I'm suggesting is that you embrace that and use imitation as the technique for learning about design and what makes for a good design. So I believe the quickest way, but still not quick, the quickest way to understand what makes for a good design is to copy a good design. Now, copying, it's a time-honored technique for learning. Artists learn their craft through copying. Musicians copy. Writers copy. Now, to be clear, I'm only advocating for copying for the purposes of learning, not to pass off as original work. So how does copying help you as an aspiring designer? The act of copying forces you to make the same design decisions as the designer did in the first place. So decisions about design details that you might not even have seen or have overlooked. And it's those details that separate a good design from an unfinished design. When you go through the copying exercise a few times, hopefully you'll start to see patterns. And then in your mind, form rules about how to solve a particular design problem. I really believe that a rule that you've learned on your own is much more valuable than something that you've either read or somebody's told you about. I think you'll have a more nuanced understanding. I want to give you a little demo of how you can learn through copying. First step, you need to find something good to copy, and hopefully it's relevant to what you're trying to build. But it doesn't have to be, right? Good design principles exemplified in design are pretty universal. If you don't have an example, you can go to places like collectui.com or dribble.com. These are places where designers share their work. So you'll find some good examples there. If you want to do some web stuff, maybe go to Squarespace in their template section, or something for mobile, the Apple or Google app stores. Familiarize with your design, really get to know it. Start with the workflow, then what each screen says, and the visuals. Now for this demo, I've chosen just one screen, so I'm going to focus just on rebuilding that one layout. Go ahead and recreate design, compare that with the original, see how close you're able to get. And as you're going through this process, try to identify what the design decisions were and what you can learn from them. So here are some examples that I got from collectui.com. I'm not sure if it comes across that well through the projector, but this is a simple form for collecting contact info. Very basic, but I think you can learn some stuff from this example. This one's another form for collecting profile and settings information. This one's a form in a language I don't understand, so we're not going to be working on this, but I think it's got something to do with currency. Here's a small form for scheduling a meeting. One for creating invoices. And this one is some sort of dashboard. And this is the one I chose, and we'll be going through this. Now, I'm not saying this is the best design or that your app has to look like this. We're just using this as a learning exercise. So here is that layout. This is the original. This is my recreation, the copy. There are a couple of fields here. Again, original and the copy. I think overall they're pretty similar. But I've made some changes. One is the banner. I just decided to simplify it a bit. And the second is the typography. Here's original and the copy. It's slightly different, but that's only because I don't have as much control over text within FileMaker than whatever tool that this designer used to create the original design. But overall, fairly similar. Let me go into layout mode here and talk a little bit about how I put this together. So here's the original inner layout at the very bottom. I've got all my backgrounds, the body, the banner, these cards. And I've grouped them all together, but only because so I can quickly turn them on and off at the same time. That really helps it make it easier to compare with the original. So I did the same sort of thing with all the content. But this time I put the content inside of a slide control. So here's the slide control. There's only one slide. I've made it as big as the entire layout.
Can you zoom in, please?
Sure. Actually, there's nothing specific that you need to see about this. I can zoom in this part. Is that better? And then for the slide control, I set the fill to none, and that will make it transparent. And so why did I do that? Well, it makes it really easy. Now that as you're creating your content, let's say I draw a square here, it's going to be automatically placed within the slide control. I can then quickly toggle that on and off. Let me turn off the background here. Toggle the content on and off and see it superimposed over the original. And so that's just a quick trick, a little trick to help you sort of get it similar to the original. Now, let me go back and go through how I recreated the design in a little more detail and try to talk about the design decisions that were made and what you may learn from that. Like I said, I start out with the sort of the background stuff. Here's the gray background. It's very, very light in color, and I suspect if you, as a person starting out to do design, when you're choosing colors, I think you tend to sort of go a little bit overboard. Colors are either too saturated or too dark. But when you copy a design like this, you'll notice that the grays are very, very light. The colors are still there, but not quite as saturated. So those are hopefully are the things that you will pick up from copying a design like this. This is the background. Here's the banner. And then designer used this technique of using little white cards to group the content. And he's also, or she, added a little drop shadow. I'm not sure if at all you can see that through the projector. But there's a little drop shadow for each of the cards to give things some depth. And again, the shadow properties are very, very, very subtle. Opacity of just 6. So what else can we learn from this? Well, it looks like the designer used the same left and right margins for the content. Here and here. And he used the same sort of spacing between the different cards. Let's look at the content for the banner. It's centered. It's aligned with the cards as well on both sides. Now, you may not want to have a banner that's this size. The designer had the room, and maybe they wanted to make a sort of a visual statement with the banner. Let's turn on the other content here. There's the profile, the stats, the accounts. So I'd say the overall impression I get from this design, as the designer created it, is that it's pretty airy, uses a lot of white space, and the content really stands out against the background, or the decoration, as I like to call it. So here's a specific example of what he tried to do. For the fields, it's just a simple line to indicate an entry field. That helps the data be more prominent. Color is also something that he's used strategically. It's all from the same sort of reddish, maroon family, but he's using that to highlight things that he thinks are important, like the field that's in focus, the checkbox, and this primary button here. So the style of the primary button, it's pretty simple. I mean, it's just a rectangle, rounded, with a small gradient, and it happens to be the same gradient as what's being used in the banner. So simple is good. He also has a second type of button here. So it's used for things that are not quite as important. Also a very simple style. What else? So he's using icons to give it some visual appeal. As far as alignment, within the cards, things are consistently left aligned, top aligned, right aligned, with the exception of this button here. So I personally would have made this the same spacing as up here on top. And one more thing, it's about typography. So he's using just one font family, which I think you should start with, but that's not a hard and fast rule. But start with one, which he's done here. But the problem is, at least within this content area, he's chosen 4 to 5 different font weights and sizes. So although he's tried to reuse the same font weight and size, for example, the data here is the same. The large label for the card is the same as with the numbers here on the side. Although he's tried to do that, I think there's still 5 different font weights. I think it would have been better if he were to reduce that down. So let me go back into layout mode and see if there's anything else. So we looked at just one example, but I think even with that one, there was a fair amount that you can learn. A lot of design decisions had to be made, and hopefully, as you repeat this exercise, you'll start seeing more and more. So let's say you've gone through that exercise several times and you're feeling good about what you're doing. How do you actually know you've progressed from imitation to inspiration? Well, you'll know you're there if you've got a collection of patterns and techniques that you've internalized and that you can readily recall. You know you're there if you can mentally dissect the design, so you wouldn't need to go through the physical exercise of doing that. You can deconstruct the design in terms of the patterns and techniques that you've learned. You know you're there if you can successfully apply the patterns you've learned to solve a design problem. And also, almost importantly, sort of know when to deviate from those rules. Finally, you'll know you're there if you recognize that you'll always be learning and evolving as a designer. I learn something new every time I experience a new design. I want to leave you with a final thought. It's a quote from a filmmaker. He said, "It's not where you take things from, it's where you take them to." And that really sums up what I hope you will take away from the session, which is, learn from what others have done, just do something even better with it. Thank you. We've got quite a bit of time for a Q&A if anybody has any questions, or catch me after the session. Some housekeeping slides. The slide deck will be here. And thank you. Thanks again for letting me share my perspective about design. Remember to fill out the evaluation and have a great rest of DevCon. Thank you.